Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 68th episode of By-The-Bywater. It is great to be back with you here right now. And you know what happened since the last time we recorded an episode? Oriana made a movie. Woo!
We did it. It exists. We shot 90 pages in 12 days. It's definitely a supposedly fun thing I'll never do again.
You definitely recommend it to everybody, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It turns out that just having more money would solve all of the problems.
It's funny how it
most
works,
most of the problems, but yeah. So, but it's there. My husband is editing right now, so.
All right. And have you officially launched a social media site or anything or account for that yet? That's public at least? Or
nothing public. We had set up as like a Kickstarter reward, a private behind the scenes Instagram. I don't know if you can still donate to the Kickstarter or whatever. I think we will make that account public at some point. But yeah, we wanted to keep all of the behind the scenes stuff just for people who had been financially supportive. But we will, there will be much more posting to come.
All right. So, we will wait on word on that as it emerges because there will be word and all that. Anyway, we're all going through stuff here. I was on a lovely family trip to Yosemite. It's great. I've posted various photos from that, including my accidental Ansel Adams knockoff, which is pretty nice, I have to say. So thank you, Google, for just converting that for me. Okay, without asking. So, and Jared, meanwhile, is adapting to becoming Fuchsia's subject more and more each day, and it's a wonderful thing. So, and it's all grand.
It's funny. She doesn't have that kind of relationship with me, I swear. Like, she doesn't think she's in charge. She does think we're equals, which is not great. Because I'm in charge, even though she doesn't know it. But she's like, I know cats. There are cats who are like, I'm the boss, and there are cats who are like, I'm just your little baby. And she's more like, you and me, kid. We're in this together.
You will be able to see more of the continuing adventures of Jared and Fuchsia on Instagram and elsewhere, of course. In any event, but with all that said, there is stuff to talk about of sorts and things like that, so we might as well plunge into it. We got some news. Jared, please take it away.
The major news this time out involves the War of the Rohirrim movie, as the publicity machine is unsurprisingly gearing up. New York City Comic Con just happened at the time of this recording, and Warner Brothers previewed a clip there. Further announcements confirmed that the release date for the film is Friday, December 13th, along with previews of toy lines and the like. So it's possible that things may get even more hectic the closer we get to it. Speaking of Warner Brothers Tolkien projects, Philippa Boyens, who seems to be more and more the central story person for all their efforts given her role with War of the Rohirrim, clarified in an interview with Empire magazine that the rumor of The Hunt for Gollum being 2 films was incorrect. It will be 1. But she then added that there's a second live-action film in the works that is, quote, still to be confirmed, unquote. As ever, it's all murky over there in various ways, but even more bemusing, the second season of The Rings of Power wrapped up, and as of this recording, it's been a few weeks and there's been zero official word on a third season yet, which, given how quickly those kinds of renewals are usually announced, Amazon took just a few days to say that Fallout would be getting a second season, for instance. It's worth noting. It sounds very possible that by the time this episode is released, that renewal will have happened, but it's also noteworthy that while the second season did okay in terms of streaming numbers, it's just that, okay. So, not the blockbuster they have openly wanted all this time.
No, indeed. And again, so far, I'm the only one who, let's just say, suffered through that season. I'll be blunt here. We will not spend time unpacking everything about it. Let's just say that choices were made. And yeah, the only thing I think I will bring up, which I will bring up as emblematic because it broke so many people's brains, even people who were saying that they still like the show, was the revelation or the whatever, I don't even know how to describe it, the catastrophe of having the stranger's true name, big surprise, be revealed when some of the proto-Hobbit characters, the Stewards, out of nowhere in a departure scene call him Grand Elf, and that is supposed to eventually mutate into Gandalf. And I'm like,
sure.
The monstrous idiocy involved, especially since, I will note, on the strict storytelling level, they already had a half explanation with the Gand thing earlier in the season.
That feels like more mystery box storytelling. Like, oh, we have to zig where the audience thinks we're going to zag. So it's not, his name isn't Gandalf because he has a Gand, or whatever. It's because it's a mutation of Grand, and it's like, what?
No.
Why?
It's a pre-existing Norse name.
Yeah.
Like, this is like giving an origin story for Thorin. That's like, I don't even know. I can't come up with something that stupid on the fly, but like, what are you doing here? That makes no sense.
Who asked for that? Like, no one. This is somehow even worse than making sure to put into a movie how Han Solo got his name. Yeah. In a universe where theoretically no one speaks Spanish, like theoretically Latin isn't a thing. Anyway, yeah, it's just. I didn't watch more than the first 20 minutes of the first episode. I have just accepted that this is not for me, and that's okay.
Yeah. I planned to watch it before this episode so that I could actually, talk about it. And I was like, you know what? My year has been bad enough already. I don't need to add to it.
You made the right choice.
Choosing joy.
I'm choosing joy.
Choosing joy.
Or at least things I can tolerate.
Yeah.
Very, very, very apt thing to do about it. Well, let's veer over to whatever's happening in Warner Brothers line. So the fact that there is a mysterious second film now being talked about, honestly, that doesn't surprise me. That just seems in keeping with whatever the Zaslav and company are coming up over there, going like, let's throw something on the wall and stick it to see what sticks. Of course, it may be just something more from the Philip New Zealand side of things, but in any event, something mysterious. I don't know what we're going to get. I don't even want to care what we're going to get. No.
My biggest issue is that they haven't asked me to do one of these things. I currently have a TV deal with Warner Brothers, so just move me over to the New Line side of things briefly, and I can help you guys.
Yeah.
Well,
you're leaving money on the table here.
Truly.
And in the meantime, War of the Rohirrim, it's coming. It's we have a date, mid December. Getting ahead of the Christmas season. It's clearly going to be one of the big releases there, or at least they're aiming for it. And we got toy lines. I guess we're going to get more. We also had We also had that little tapestry, quote unquote, announcement, which was sort of like, no, that was just a semi 3D-ish thing, whatever that was. So we'll link it.
So I didn't actually see that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It was more like a sort of like a combination of it's something. When they said tapestry, I was like, oh, did they do a knockoff like Bayou tapestry or something? Sure, why not? But no, it was more like how to put it. It was like a drawing with showing various scenes and the thing, which you lay it out. Sure, you can call it how a tapestry, storytelling tapestry functions. But was it meant to be something actually woven or things like this? No, it was just sort of an overlay of various, semi 3D-ish shots and things like that. So it's sort of like, okay, nice, I guess. Cool. So, action moments from the film. Okay, fine. I've seen weirder, seen worse, but it's just sort of like, okay. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see what's coming in a couple of months. This may have just been something dreamed up by the marketers. Who knows? So that's that with that. Nothing more to say about any of that. So we might as well get into the main topic of the episode. And this time around, it was Oriana's choice, and an interesting one it has turned out to be. And we'll thank everyone in advance for a lot of responses that we got on this that will feed into our discussion. But saying no more for now, Oriana, please. Take it away.
Yeah, I do want to say in advance that if you are listening to this and you did respond to our prompt either on Blue Sky or some other platform, and I don't read it out loud here, it's not because it wasn't a good response. You all had really good responses. I'm so happy that our listeners, or at least the people who follow us on social media, are very thoughtful people. Kudos to everyone out there who is hopefully listening. But yeah, what does it mean when we, or you listeners, or other people in your life, when we say something feels like Tolkien? That's like a pretty subjective metric. Is feeling like Tolkien like pornography? Something you just know when you see it?
Oh my.
Telepornography.
This is a reference to Supreme Court. It's not, I didn't just make that up whole cloth. But, is it something that we can actually define, which I think actually Tolkien would probably have taken a dim view of, scientizing, trying to quantify what makes his work feel singular. So, we did do the extremely scientific thing of asking people on the internet what they thought. And just a very quick selection of responses. One of them was, quote, "To me, Tolkien writes as if he is narrating history. It doesn't, quote, feel like a story, or rather, the story feels like it is pieced together from something that really happened." Another response, "Tolkien, to me, has always struck me as intrinsically melancholic. Even in his most lighthearted writings, there's always a bittersweet undercurrent, a certainty that nothing lasts forever." And our final selection is, "What feels like Tolkien to me? Bullet point. Sweeping world building, heavy on vanished, half-forgotten past greatness. Bullet point. A certain formality and distance in language and style. Bullet point. Wonder and sadness mixed. Adventure and homesickness. Restlessness and love of place. Bullet point. Deep distrust of technology and spiders." Total agreement. I feel like you always have to have weird, nasty, large spiders if something is going to feel like Tolkien. I actually had not considered that before this response, and now it is what we're going to spend the rest of the episode talking about. But I actually kind of wonder, and this is something that we can discuss, with a lot of definitions of sort of nebulous or subjective concepts, is it easier to define feels like Tolkien by the absence of feeling like Tolkien? That is, sort of one thing that's consistently missing, I think, from basically every adaptation of Tolkien's works, is a genuine sense of reverence for the natural world. We have a fair amount of New Zealand glamour shots in the Peter Jackson movies, but Jackson had to do so much else with these movies that I don't think that they were able to really take the time that they needed to inspire that sense of sort of passive reverence, not reference. I think you'd actually need someone maybe like Terrence Malick for live action, or Hayao Miyazaki for animation, to actually get that feeling. But if I'm not going to define what feels like Tolkien by the absence of Tolkienian feeling, I think what might sum it up best for me is actually something that the man wrote himself in The Lord of the Rings, when Sam in Lothlorien says, "I feel as if I was inside a song, if you take my meaning." But what is you guys' personal metric for something that feels like Tolkien?
Okay. Jared, you want to kick it off?
A lot of the responses kind of sum up
right? They were really good.
They were really good, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
A huge part of it is that melancholy, multiple axes of melancholy, not just nostalgia for the past, but the present is slipping away, and the future may not be great. And that, they said, that sense of environment, the natural world, even if he doesn't people think he spends a ton of time describing flowers or whatever, he really doesn't. But, he knows when to deploy that, so that it's you have a sense of whatever place you're in as distinct from the place you just left. Also, an interest in language.
Yeah. Do you guys think that because the description of the natural world that he uses is so kind of evocative, is that why it feels like there's so much of it, do you think?
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
Easy answer.
Yay!
Easy answer there. Well, let me throw in a bit more, and maybe this can also serve as part of my initial answer to the question too. It's been remarked before how arguably the story is in many ways front loaded. You get a lot more description of the journey early on than towards the end, when you can argue that Tolkien maybe is sort of trying to finally get to the ending more quickly, and things like that. So there's an element of that. Of course, the early parts of the books were the ones that were the most rewritten, just because he almost had to keep going back and going like, okay, let me reboot and start again and get this right. So there's that too. But with that said, something like the building on your point, he's not describing flowers all the time, but he's describing the landscapes, the journey, the process, the experience of going through something. Mm-hmm. And he does that very well. Now, let's step back maybe and sort of cast this net wide. How do we think of this as distinct from, let's say, other authors? Because that might be a good way to also frame this question, because if we're defining something as Tolkien, what is anti-Tolkien, you can argue, but maybe more accurately, what would someone in a similar vein could try and do or would do is that the description of the journey that Frodo and Sam and Pippin in particular take to get to Buckland is easily has always been one of my favorite parts of the read. It is meant to be the story of a journey that grows a little more with time, of course, as the Nazgul appear and everything gets a little more tense, and there are moments of sudden relief and sudden fear. But also, it's, to my mind, it is so well done because you have to catch yourself and remind yourself, this is an imaginary landscape. No place ever actually looked or felt like this. He's drawing on his own experiences from doing things like this. He was very much, this was his thing. He experiences that he enjoyed in, let's say, the English countryside, however defined. Some of it was more quote-unquote wild than others. And of course, we have to keep in mind that this is also, he's drawing on memories, in many cases drawing back almost 100 years old now. So it's, if not further, much has changed. There are things that we no longer see and say in terms of what we would say about the landscape now. It's almost hard to see, and that of course fits in with the whole theme of disappearing and things like that. But to come back to this point, the gift of Tolkien is to truly make you feel like you're walking these paths, you're seeing these sights, you're observing these trees, you're hearing these things, you're hearing that distant cruel cry from across a landscape, even as you're sort of hiding away in a tree belt and you're wondering what that is. It's sort of like he's very good at these details. And to the point again about Jared saying, people stereotype him as, he's describing a lot of time in the trees. He is not Basil expositioning this landscape. He is not, going like, as you know, Frodo, this particular flower. He doesn't do that. And things are just simply introduced for the most part. He will elaborate here and there, but he'll just as often not elaborate. And one of my favorite moments, I think we've mentioned this on the podcast before, is when, the three of them are sleeping and we get a fox in English to himself going like, hey, what's this? Is this explained further? No. Does it need to be? No. Does it say everything it needs to be? Yes. It's one of those, and then it's gone moments. It's something that's there, but that's really about it in that time.
That is one of those understated moments of whimsy that pops up that I think are very necessary in a work like The Lord of the Rings to transition us from this, idyllic sort of place into the dangers ahead, and from, a much lighter work like The Hobbit into The Lord of the Rings proper. Because, we don't see too much of that. The next animals that we kind of see observing them are like, the Crebine from Dunland? Is that kind of the next? And that's not an observation that anyone wants. And we don't get their perspective. I'm sure there's a fanfic or something. Which actually might be kind of fun now that I think about it. But I think the melancholy is really what stands out to me every time. It's the richness of the world building, but the building of a world that is lost is maybe even that's what makes it more than just information, I think. Yeah. I think, like what anti-Tolkien, what Tolkien is not kind of stuff, like thinking of notable imitator that we have already talked about, The Sword of Shannara, where theoretically, like there's a ton of landscape description or whatever, but it is
kind of just information, and there's no sense of it as an environment that will exist with or without the characters observing it, if that makes sense. And I think Tolkienian description does have that sense where it's like, you just happen to be here for this, but these trees will be growing long after the plot doesn't need them. It's interesting too to compare them in the sense of being, they're both post-apocalyptic literature in a way, but Lord of the Rings and even the Silmarillion, which is kind of pre-apocalyptic, is like, bad stuff happened here. There's the melancholy suffusing the landscape and all of that. So it has all of this emotional content, and then Sword of Shannara, which is much more explicitly leaning into post-apocalyptic stuff. It's like, there was a building here. Who even knows? Like, what is that? I don't know. Which is not an invalid way of doing it, but doesn't have the same oomph, I guess, that the hobbits coming across half of a statue does in Lord of the Rings.
Let me think if I can sort of put this into phrasing and also maybe sort of expand to include other observations you could say about Tolkien. Something that just struck me in terms of the melancholy is how, it's often sort of seen in Tolkien as sort of as the logical end point, because it ends as it ends. However, arguably, that melancholy is there to start with, and is actually tweaked very carefully in Lord of the Rings. Thinking about how basically Frodo, when he is given the quest or things like this, or at least in discussion with Gandalf, he sort of realizes he has this responsibility. He kind of already feel like, I may not come back from this. And it's funny to me how, I can't remember if it's Merry or Pippin or whatever. It's in the see, when they get to Buckland and the conspiracy is revealed, as they put it, and they talk about, we've seen you just looking on your walks, looking over landscapes and going like, shall I ever look down this view again, I wonder, and things like this.
Yeah.
And you get a sense that they were sort of going like, yeah, we've seen you going around doing your sort of like, oh, woe is me type thing and all that, which is hilarious because it is both funny in the moment. It's a wonderfully little illustrative bit of character observation where you're looking at somebody from the outside and trying to sort of get what they're doing. It's sort of like, oh geez, come on, you're just moving, you're whatever and all that. So, and they're treating it on the level more as adventure, whereas he's the only one, and Sam arguably to some degree, but he truly is the only one who has the strongest sense of, okay, this is not a joke, and he is trying to convey that early on, and that I think is important too. It's not Frodo is not and he's such a weirdly fascinating character for being the seeming central character. Is he though? Is that somebody like him is very much burdened with the idea that this really is bad and this is momentous and I'm and all that. And it's almost sort of like, how do you process that? How would anybody process that? In some respects, it's interesting seeing the character development of Frodo as he deals with what has been stuck on him over this time. It's sort of like it's a relentless year-long portrait, because if we want to take in general the whole calendar year that it all moves through, of somebody having to go through the most strenuous, beyond strenuous mental and physical experience that almost can't be imagined, and what comes after that, and the result is like, it's sort of like that sense of having actually gone through something in a landscape in its own way, a mental landscape, if you like, is another element, I would say, that what feels Tolkien, that you've actually seen some shit. That's kind of the best way to put it.
Yeah, the trauma too, I think, and not to that sounds very buzzwordy now.
Yeah.
But there's a very distinctive way that he uses it, where he's, World War I really did a number on him, and he's not alone in that, obviously. But the transformation of that kind of really horrendous experience into an experience of beauty, even if it is sad, is hugely Tolkienian, I think. And it that goes right back to the beginning of the Silmarillion, where the music of the Ainur is corrupted, not corrupted, but Melkor tries to take it over, and it still is the music takes what he's trying to do and transforms it into beauty, even if it is sad. And that's I remember reading that as a kid, and the phrasing is something like this immense sadness from which its beauty chiefly came. And I was like, oh my God, I'd never considered that sadness could be beautiful. And it just kind of flipped a new lens to look at Lord of the Rings by. Mm-hmm. And it was just mind blowing at the time. I can't, whoa, oh my God, yes, okay.
It does feel like a perspective that comes, of course, out of having gone through quite a lot of messed up situations in his life, but also being kind of older when he started. The Hobbit is a lighter work. While he's working on The Lord of the Rings, he's pushing 50, right? Yeah, he's like in his 50s at least. And then, but that is quite there's you've had some life experience by the time you're in your 50s, and I think people in their 20s are certainly capable of profundity, but there is something, I think, about as you get older and start to understand how sadness can be beautiful and how long and short the long defeat really is. That really colors your work, I think, in a way that can be hard to find in other people's sort of imitations, I suppose, or responses. But it also helps to have a crazy vocabulary. I was trying to remember all of the words that I learned reading, particularly The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. But there were only like two that it was a lot of the like natural words. Again, like growing up in Florida, my natural vocabulary, like my set of words to describe nature was very different. And I would say much more limited than it should have been. Because like my family wasn't like an outdoorsy family, really. So we weren't even spending a whole lot of time in the swamps and whatnot. Catching catfish or whatever.
Wrestling gators.
We had gators in the lake, and I knew what a cottonmouth was, and palmetto bugs and whatnot. But then there was this whole other world of, I think I got hints of it in Narnia. But, it was like, what the hell is a thrush? Badger brocks and whatnot. And so learning all of these new ways to talk about natural features, some of which I had never seen and wouldn't for, a decade or more, that just lends such a magic that I haven't really found in another author except maybe David Foster Wallace, but that's different. His vocabulary is very different.
I would imagine so.
Yeah, well, Tolkien uses footnotes, not as many. I think maybe to sort of circle back on a point that I think is worth unpacking, and something that we've talked about lightly over the course of the podcast, but we never really have totally delved into. One of these days, we might find the best context to do this. And that was you mentioned the question of reverence for nature. Of course, there's also the wider questions of reverence, period. And as we've certainly mentioned, Tolkien is very much, thanks to the conversion experience that his mother went through when she had lost her husband, things were loose end. She found comfort in the Catholic Church and converted and raised her sons that way. And her own early passing sort of sealed the devotion, at least on J.R.'s part. I don't know about his brothers necessarily. He's sort of not the mystery figure, but he obviously lived his own life. And that, of course, he has come down. We've seen, I would say, also, in terms of how we talk about what feels Tolkien, I'd like to introduce something that I don't think we've talked about much at all, really, on the podcast. And that is the sense that in this century, let's say, especially now that Tolkien is a more widely known thing, is the best way to put it, which, more than the person, the idea of, Tolkien, you're talking about this, you have this image, you had certain visual images almost overridden, the words themselves, people know, etc. And that is, we've seen a lot of earnest, sometimes maybe too earnest, Catholic, writers, apologists going like, let's reclaim him and talk about him in these contexts and things like this. Some of which is so much more explicitly designed to be, on the verge of polemic or some sort of thing like that. It's beyond apologetic. It's more like you have to understand things viewpoint. And when, clearly he was looking at it through a more, let's say, sublimated point of view, even if he was very conscious of the fact that he considered it that Lord of the Rings was both a Christian and a Catholic work. He said so himself. What I would argue is that in terms of what feels like Tolkien, it's not so much even just the question of reverence in terms of religious belief. It is how it is applied. By which I mean, If we had to, and I'm way oversimplifying, but the two most active writers that come to my mind from Tolkien's era who gained fame around the same time he did at that time would have been, or even earlier, would have been Evelyn Waugh and Graham Greene, both of whom were very much more, much more explicitly were addressing, they obviously weren't fantasy writers, but they were like playing out ideas of, Catholic feelings, themes, and interpretations in their work, which was in many cases quite popular and very well known. The ending of Brideshead Revisited is essentially a message of the main figure sort of having a semi-crypto-Catholic conversion, but it's clear there's that, and then the various adventures and also the serious works that Green did and all that. But again, these are things that are set in the quote-unquote real world, and within those dynamics. Maybe you can throw in G.K. Chesterton too if you want to, as another writer along those lines. But Tolkien is not doing that. He's very much he is creating in a thoroughly imaginative landscape, which, as has often been noted and is remarkable, seems to have an absence of any kind of formal religion as we understand it as such in a very broad scope. There's no priests, there's no temples except one big bad one if you want to count what happens in Numenor, etc., etc. Although there are clearly places that are seen to be holy or hallowed, reactions to them, there are certain customs, but it's interesting, of course, how it flows away there. This universality of reverence, this sense of reverence that's not tied to identifiable doctrine or practice, is something that, while it's not necessarily uniquely Tolkien, I think is very remarkably Tolkien. I think it is something that fits into that because there is a sense of drawing on something there, and that's also drawing on the author's own deep belief, but has been fascinatingly sublimated and transformed in the imaginative telling. The roots are clearly there throughout. You see elements of it, but it exists very much in its own world. It makes sense almost that you have 20th century Catholic writers of a mind trying like, no, we need to make this more explicit, precisely because they almost can't believe that something like what Tolkien has done has gone so broadly outside the idea of a Catholic work of fiction, however you define it.
It's a lot to unpack.
Yeah. The ideas that we have about, I think this is not really a thing that people think about as much currently, the sort of delineation between the sacred and the profane and how we look at those and how we move between those two worlds. And, they are both very clearly delineated in Tolkien's work, and also things that seem like they would maybe be profane end up being sacred, like, the behavior of the hobbits in the Shire, maybe, which does feel very Catholic, I guess.
An earthiness, one might almost say. If we also want to...
So talking out of my ass on this.
Come on, cite canon law. If we want to look at it from also the point of view of what distinguishes Tolkien from other strands of fantasy, at least at the time, and also consider how that sort of plays out down the line, another aspect might be to learn, and these are names we've invoked before, but it's helpful to sort of like create this wider context. You have one of the folks who responded noted that's my friend Mark Sinker. Hi, Mark. Is saying like, hey, we want to talk about William Morris. There's the thing there. There is that, certainly. And there's no reason why we can't talk about it at some point. I would bring up more. However, we've also got the examples, you could say, of what's out there, what's distinct. You've got people like James Cabell in America, who is doing, very much, it's kind of deep irony, hiding deep feeling at points with his various intertwined, massive, pseudo-medieval landscape. You've got Lord Dunsany essentially going off into wild streams of imagination, which are both hilarious and wry, and also quite vivid too in terms of their impact. But they also they function in a different level in terms of what they're doing. Certainly, some absolutely imaginative moments. I still think the end of the King of Elfland's Daughter is absolutely remarkable. It's something I think very few writers have really matched. Then you've got good old E.R. Edison, and all that. But I would also throw in, you got someone like Robert Howard too, maybe in a more well-known American context, where again it's more like the emphasis is on the adventure, and all that. A guy with a sword beating up other people with swords and monsters and loving ladies along the side. So typical, all that. And again, it's there's no consistency consistency as such. It's more a writer, in this case Howard in Texas, with his pools of, whatever historical knowledge he's committed to hand. And he clearly read a lot of this stuff going like, hey, what if I transform this and what if I did that? And I've created a thing. And there's no sense of anything in terms of deep self-consistency beyond you tell a rattling tale. You put all that up against this sense that Tolkien has, you get a sense Tolkien has a mission. And if you don't buy into the mission, that itself can be a reason why you look at it sort of like, if it doesn't quite work for you, because there's a certain all or nothingness about the Lord of the Rings in particular. It's sort of like, if you don't buy in, you don't buy in. Yeah. And that's accentuated even more with Silmarillion for reasons we need not get into. It's kind of obvious. It's sort of like, oh boy, if you can't take that. Yeah, I try to imagine someone who would really enjoy the Silmarillion, but not like Lord of the Rings. I'm like, how does that even work? That does not work. I can't see it.
I feel like I know somebody, actually. I can't think of who, but I feel like I know somebody who prefers the Silmarillion to the Lord of the Rings.
All right. Well, if that's the case, good on you, whoever you are. You're a unique individual. Yeah. And that might color your aspect about what feels Tolkien in that regard. So
I feel like I would say I somewhat disagree that he's on a mission with Lord of the Rings, because maybe just because of how I grew up in seeing literature that was much more, air quotes, literature that was much more explicitly on a mission.
Right,
Like an obvious example would be C.S. Lewis, but there's also people like Frank Peretti or whatever who are writing books that are like, this is a Christian book and this is how the world works. And if you don't accept that, you're kind of screwed. And Tolkien seems to have a lot more room in his worldview for other things. Like,
do we mean like clarity of narrative when we talk about mission?
Yeah, that might be maybe was aiming at. I mean, I get what you're saying. Yeah, okay. I don't think. Yeah, mission may be a loaded word. I don't think Tolkien was out to convert anybody, although he clearly,
Yeah, that's how I understood you, obviously. Yeah. So I was like, I don't know about that one.
Yeah, more than fair. I mean, there was that article. I think we did a link or something I mentioned earlier this year, which kind of was. There's that Lev Grossman article. Basically, it's sort of like, hey, you may not know this, kids, about about what Tolkien's faith and all that, and talking about the walk with Lewis converting to Lewis. That is an example of Tolkien maybe on a mission in his personal life with somebody who he was very close to. But I don't get that sense in the books beyond in that particular way, which is a very interesting distinction. So again, feeling Tolkien is not. Yeah, maybe that's another aspect of what feels Tolkien. He's not browbeating you, which again is the difference between him and Middle-earth and Narnia, which is, however High Church of Englandy, a browbeating. So
yeah, Lord of the Rings feels very Wells for boys. Does that resonate with anyone?
Yeah. I mean, any Wells for boys reference resonates with me, so obviously.
So we've talked a lot about like Tolkien as compared and contrasted with other authors. Adaptation wise is kind of, that was once again the impetus for this was I see people saying that Rings of Power feels like Tolkien. What's going on there? What's happening? And I don't want to say those people are wrong, because this is, again, a very subjective thing, and what feels like Tolkien to them is probably like the Peter Jackson movies. And or they just have taste that is different from mine.
Yeah.
I almost said bad taste, but that's mean.
That is so mean.
But my taste is flawless, so I don't know what's going on there.
Yeah.
I don't know. Are there elements of adaptations that you guys want to point out specifically as feeling very Tolkien or not?
I think, I mean, we brought up Jackson really leaning into the New Zealand of it all. That feels very Tolkien to me. When the Rings of Power does that, it feels more Tolkien to me. It doesn't do it enough.
Well, I mean, in terms of adaptation, I mean, part of the issue of any adaptation by default is you can't luxuriate in the words. You can't. The narrator is gone unless the narrator is so utterly intrinsic to the story that they have to be there in some form and presence. In other words, he's conveyed with that. I mean, there are many examples I could try and pull out of when they try and do that, but sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes you get instances like, I don't know, Baz Luhrmann framing Great Gatsby, except our narrator is Nick is curling in an insane asylum. I'm like, sure, go ahead and do that. So,
that was a weird whatever.
Another classic case of people falling in love with the trappings of the story, but not getting the point of the story. So maybe a more appropriate comparison we can be made there. But even moving beyond from that, the emphasis in any adaptation on the mechanics of the plot tends to by default prioritize that. Thus, the fact that Aragorn in the book is someone who is a key character, but is ultimately not the central character, and is carrying out things that are in many respects on the side with motives that we rarely see inside from, that we rarely get those details, is a lot different from, say, Jackson's, where, Viggo Mortensen is essentially one of the two or three leads, essentially. If we could say there are three leads of the movie, it would be, by default, Frodo. It would be Ian McKellen, and it would be Viggo. It's sort of like, okay, again, you can do that, but it's not the book. So that's a problem with adaptation there. What makes it interesting is that something that you can't really talk about as adaptation, because it's not, but it's nonetheless an art form, is where you have something like an unabridged reading. Thus, for instance, the more recent Andy Serkis readings, but there have been the other ones too, like the Rob Inglis and so forth, where you are getting the story. You're just simply getting it told rather than read. And there you have someone who by default is bringing a dramatic interpretation to the material, however they choose to do it, however they choose to read the voices, that's a narrative voice, etc. But that's a way of sort of conveying it, getting it across in a form that not really any other form can do, because no other form allows you to do that, is kind of what it comes down to. And everything else tends to be something like, as I said, you focus on mechanics of the plot, or you may illustrate moments. You can, artists love Tolkien precisely because there are many dramatic moments to be done there. But do those moments, can they convey necessarily the text or what is written about them? Not really. It's a different. That's the issue of adaptation, though, and that's not a problem. That's intrinsic. That's something you can look at about 8 million different things in terms of how books are interpreted or writing, whatever. That's not unique to Tolkien or the problem here. This simply is the nature of how it works.
Yeah. Oh, I did think of two. This is what I was going to say before my cat distracted me, but these are two things that occurred to me. One, something that feels very Tolkien in adaptation is casting an old queen as Gandalf. Perfect.
Okay, all right.
Flawless decision making there.
Yeah, as we have said before, Gandalf can be just kind of a little bee.
Yeah, when Ian McKellen... Anyway, so the other one, much more seriously, is, weirdly enough, in the... Oh, God, is it the rank... It must be the Rankin Bass Return to the King.
Okay.
One of the only things that it does correctly, which we did talk about in our episode on that, is that moment where somebody, I think it's Sam, I can't remember, basically has a vision of like a paradise where like an orc and a hobbit or an elf are walking, like basically frolicking hand in hand. And it's like, it's a little silly, but it's that the possibility of redemption that it holds out, that the Lord of the Rings itself never really offers these characters. That feels very true in spirit to Tolkien without being literally Tolkien.
Yeah, the sense of it's interesting. If we talk about something that what feels Tolkienian is the idea that he has some sort of perspective of what happens after the big battle, which is not something you often get or always get, and quite honestly, so much of what fantasy has followed kind of exists now because that the idea of what happens after this, almost like he put it in there saying like, no, it's not just simply you fight the big battle and then you live happily ever after. He interrogates what happily ever after is in his own way. There have been so many like explorations of unpacking like what is a happy ending and things like this. Tolkien arguably in his own way sort of said, hey, here's an example of it. Guess what? It's not all flowers and roses. It really is not. What happens when there are things you can't escape. What happens when the experience you've gone through and the burden of the history's crush is there? The idea that there isn't in fact a final ending. That again is not necessarily unique to Tolkien, but I think putting that in there is kind of a big argument against the oversimplification of Tolkien, and I mean that in terms of both negatively and positively. To their credit, the adaptation tries to a degree, if we're talking about Jackson's films, but of course, famously, we get the ending, but we don't get the Scouring of the Shire. And arguably, the ending feels a little when we don't have the Scouring of the Shire in Jackson's point of view. And all that we have the quick hints, we have moments, and there are ways that the ending as Jackson film would work that you do get a certain sense of it. I'm not completely knocking it, but it is a case where it almost goes back to the question of reverence. We don't have anything as powerful as Sam, everyone pulling up to bag in, and Sam bursting out into tears, realizing that the party tree's been hacked down.
Yeah,
that is what feels Tolkien right there. This idea that ruin can touch everywhere, and you're not free from it, and all that, and that in order to get something back like what you had, you'll have to put in the work. But it further demonstrates that nothing is guaranteed, and arguably that's the entire point in some respects of Scouring of Shire. We did do an episode on that, so we'll link back to that too. So there's so much more, I guess, to talk about feels Tolkien. I'd like to throw in one thing, sort of building up. We're getting near where we need to start wrapping up a bit here. So let me throw this out as one further thing that I've often turned over, and I've never found a good answer. And my sense is my reading is not broad enough to get a sense of what this best answer would be. But it would be this: when it comes to talking about some feeling Tolkien, we tend to, I think, understandably look in the viewpoint of stuff that is fantastic literature that's followed in its wake. Why? Because of the huge impact it's had, and also other creative fields in that endeavors, whether we're talking video games or whatever. I mean, we can name all sorts of modern video games of the 21st century that are clearly trying to aim for their own, you could say, Tolkienian landscape. The thing I've often wondered about and thought about, and more with time, is trying to deduce out where and how Tolkien's influence goes beyond that into other forms, and how. And by that I mean, what mainstream writers, or real world authors, if you want to call it that, writing fiction that's meant to be set in our world today, are Tolkien fans or Tolkien followers, or are inspired by Tolkien, or drawing on something that is Tolkienian, and how does that play out? That's not a field I'm all too familiar with. I don't know what's out there. I don't know if there is much out there. I think there would be, though. I think in many respects, like, you have people like, we mentioned Lev Grossman and all that. Okay, fine. The idea is somebody who's explicitly trying to do that. What if Tolkien lived on, the Lower East Side for a while and had his undergraduate degree from Columbia instead of Oxford? Fine. But I mean, or whatever. But by that I mean more the idea that these days we're seeing so many more writers, directors, musicians, whatever, and all that, basically saying like, no, I draw on things that are not what you think I would be drawing on. I grew up on this stuff, and all that. Someone like Marlon James is a good example. He talks about how Tolkien inspired him. So it's one of those things that's sort of like, okay, you might want to start rethinking about how we think about Marlon James's work, which is, he has done more imaginative fiction in recent years, but he's also made his name with much more, quote unquote, real world fiction. So like, okay, where are the connections there? What feels Tolkien in that? Who are the other authors out there, and not just necessarily English ones, who are, where are those feeling? Where is that bubbling up? Where are they coming out? What are the connections that can be made there? That, I think, is what I think allows Tolkien to escape from being, this term is loaded, ghettoized into the idea of like, you're only influencing this. You're only influencing the trilogy paperbacks you're seeing over here or whatever and all that. And we've talked about influence before and all that. But this is the type of thing that I think when we talk about what feels Tolkienian is like, well, who are the authors who are trying to aim for whatever he's doing in their own particular ways, and how are they transmuting that into their work, even if it's not quote-unquote fantastic literature? That, I think, is a key question that I think deserves more thought than certainly I can bring to bear on it. I think it's a wide field, though, at this point.
Yeah, are you taking theme? Are you taking a certain perspective? Are you using a lot of older sounding, sort of rooted in the languages of Britain, not English so much as sort of more Gaelic-ish languages does that count as Tolkienian influence? Is anyone even doing that these days? Are you? Yeah, I like to think that I carry through a lot of the themes and perspectives in my own work, even if none of it really actually feels Tolkien-y in any other way. But I think the imprint on me was so deep that there are certainly certain themes that I will carry through my work, probably for the rest of the time I can do work.
And Jared, since we admittedly had a whole episode where you were talking about that, we won't ask you to repeat that. We'll throw in a link to the to that Resisting Tolkien, that episode from a couple things ago. But maybe in your own experience in terms of reading others and reading beyond necessarily the genre or whatever, do you sense anything along the lines of what I was mentioning, or is it a different kind of question in your eye?
It's hard to say. So I haven't kept up with a ton of recent stuff just because I've had to deal with the other side of fantasy literature for a bit. So, but I feel like a lot of the stuff I've read, I don't know what the authors would say about it. Mm-hmm. The pendulum has swung away from what we think of as Tolkienian fantasy, I think. A lot of people aren't doing what, like, fantasy trademark symbol, like the big world building and all of this. Like, it's much more focused on a specific thing, or it's influenced by very non-Western sources or whatever, because we spent so long with fantasy being in dialogue with Tolkien, whether imitating or reacting to him. Like China Mieville spent so long trying to do anti-Tolkien stuff, which is fine. You do you, boo. But and now we're kind of, I feel like we're reacting to that reaction, and it's back to being like earnest and sincere and not like just middle finger to Tolkien. But it didn't come back exactly, more like it zigzagged. So whether all these authors are thinking about his influence or resisting his influence or whatever, it's just, that's not even the question that they're, we kind of talked about this in the Resisting Tolkien episode. They're just not, that's not part of the thought process at all. It's just like, we're not doing that. Like, respect him as a titan of the genre, but like, there's other things we could be doing thematically, or just in terms of like literally what's on the page. It's just not there, which is fine. I don't think there's any reason that the fantasy genre should be dominated by one voice.
No. Quite right. Well, Oriana, do you want to sort of wrap it up if you have any final thoughts for the evening? So.
Yes, I do. My final thought is that I think Terrence Malick should direct a Silmarillion mini-series.
I've been saying that.
I
would enjoy that very, very much indeed.
I don't know, man. I think that would just look, it would at least look really cool.
Yeah. Oh, I can't wait. I can't wait for it to be 50% an elf woman in a wheat field running her hands through the stalks, and then 50% an incomprehensible creation sequence.
Yeah.
I am looking for him shooting like 9 days worth of TV show and then
like
cutting it down
to actual film too.
Yeah. And then like entire actors are cut out of it, and they're like, I was playing Melkor. Why am I not in there?
Why am I not in there?
Yeah,
just a sort of shadowy presence in the background and it goes away. So a big close up of a huge spider leg or two, because you got to have the spiders.
He wants to go all the way back to the original thing where it was Tevildo, Prince of Cats.
Yes, let's see that happen. Why not? So, all right. Okay, the time has come to select a new episode topic. The choice is Jared's. It will be our final episode of the year. Jared, what are we talking about?
Well, for episode 69, nice.
I knew one of you was going to make that joke. I knew it. I felt it.
I
was fighting down. And I'm like, geez. Okay, fine. We got it out of the way. Go on.
Look, if there's an episode 420, it's going to be even. Anyway. So as kind of a companion piece to this episode, actually, and I was hoping we wouldn't talk too much about it so that I wouldn't have to switch topics at the last second. Nostalgia.
Ooh.
Because I was thinking the other day about nostalgia, but like not just in Tolkien, but how a bunch of fairly important and powerful people in our world today have nostalgia for something that they think the book is presenting like the Lord of the Rings is presenting, that it really isn't. So it's nostalgia within the work, but also the nostalgia people are projecting into it.
I love this.
Very good choice of topic. And yes, how we talk about it may be shaped by events. We'll leave it at that. We'll leave it at that.
Oh, man, yeah. Oh, no.
Deep breath, deep cleansing breath. This episode will be released before a certain day.
Oh my God, like the day before, right?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
We're trying not to carbon date our episodes too much here, but in any event, there we are with that. So yes, deep breath, serene, calm, go forward, reject fear, and
despair is the tool of the enemy.
Yes, exactly. I've seen that quote used more than once in its correct proper context this year. So, and I am fine with that. So anyway, that said, we will come back to you next time with a new episode. Again, final one for the year to wrap it all up. Hey, it'll be our first one not talking about a certain Jackson film because we've run out for the moment. We will see what the future brings on that front. But in any event, thank you all again very much for listening. We all really appreciate it. And again, thank you for everyone who commented with our responses and questions on what feels like Tolkien. It absolutely really helped frame our thoughts about the episode, and we appreciate it greatly, and we appreciate all you folks. Please feel free to send in all comments. Get us bythebywater@gmail.com. Our webpage is, of course, megaphonic.fm/bythebywater with our episode guide. And the three of us, as well as the show, are available individually on Blue Sky and other social media spots out there. You know where you can find us at this point. Trust us. We've got links on the main webpage there as well. That is about it for now. We thank you all very much. We look forward to coming back to you next time. Until then.